All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. Hopefully people listening at home can hear. I'm Michael Flynn, I'm director of the Security Studies program here at K-State. This is a panel on the invasion of Ukraine by Russia that began last week, sponsored by the Security Studies program, departments of history and political science here. We're really happy so many people could show up. I think like many of you, we are kind of scrambling, watching the news, trying to make sense of what's happening and what's likely to happen next. So, hopefully today we can provide a little bit of insight into the background conditions that led to this war, and think a little bit about what we might see happening next, as well as just making sense of what's happening in front of us. Media accounts are kind of coming in from all over, and it can be very difficult to suss out what's happening accurately, right? To try to get an accurate read on the situation. So I will keep my remarks very brief so that we can kind of maximize the time that we have with our panelists here. And so as kind of a brief bit of background here, on February 23rd, depending on kind of the exact date that you go on, could be a day later, but Russian military forces invaded neighboring Ukraine. This follows several months of military buildup where the Russian government was amassing personnel and forces on its border with Ukraine. And this buildup itself follows kind of 8 years of low intensity conflict in Ukraine and the 2014 annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. And so this is not something that has come out of nowhere, right? But there's still a lot of kind of backstory in the kind of near past. Come on in, welcome everybody. We've got seats over here on the left if people are looking for a place to sit. Come on over, it's okay. And so, we're trying to make sense of what happened in kind of our recent history and maybe the more distant past that led to this event, and again, what's likely to happen next. For those of you at home, hopefully you can hear me on Zoom. The chat should be open for questions. So in addition to everybody here, we welcome later on when we get to the Q&A, we welcome engagement from people on Zoom, from people here in the audience. So, please contribute to the extent that you are, capable and willing and would like to. And with that, I will briefly introduce our panelists here who will be speaking and providing a little bit of background context. And then again, later on, we'll get into some questions and answers. So first we have Vera Smirnova, assistant professor in the departments of geography and political science. Carla Martinez-Machain from the Department of Political Science. Andrew Orr from the Department of History. Former President Richard Myers, I think he just said he retired like a week ago and he's back, so he just must really love it here. Wish it could be for maybe, I hope the rest of your trip is for, more joyous topics, but more notably and more seriously, President Myers formerly served as a general in the U.S. Air Force and chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he's really uniquely positioned to speak from that professional military background about what we're seeing and tying that into kind of the broader sort of geopolitical issues facing Europe. And last but not least, Jeff Pickering from the Department of Political Science has graciously volunteered to serve as moderator, but Jeff has his own sort of source of expertise, deep well to draw on in these topics as well. So I'm sure he'll have more to add as well. But with that, I will take a seat and turn it over to Jeff and the panelists.
Well, welcome everyone. As Mike briefly pointed out, I think we have a very complex and brutal situation occurring, and we are incredibly lucky to have at K-State to have such a wonderful group of experts on this panel to help us bring some detail out and help us understand. The way we're going to proceed is we're going to start with Dr. Orr, and he's going to give us some background to the events that we're seeing today. Dr. Smirnova is going to talk about Russian nationalism and Putin's, the radicalization of his discourse, if not his own radicalization. Dr. Martinez-Machain is going to talk about the U.S. response, the Western response, and perhaps civilian victimization. And General Myers is going to talk about the military situation in Ukraine and where we go from here. So some broader comments. I've asked everyone to speak for about 10 minutes. That should leave a lot of time for questions and dialogue. When we have questions, I'm going to try to repeat so that people on Zoom can hear it. If I don't repeat your question faithfully, just let me know. So about 10 minutes each, and we'll start with Dr. Orr.
All right, well, thank you. As my colleague said, I'm a historian, so I'm going to start us off by talking about the past. It's what we do. It also allows me to delay until later in the presentation saying things that may make me look foolish when I make inaccurate predictions about what's going to come next. Living in the past is the great privilege of the historical profession, after all. Putin is often portrayed in Western media as a master strategist. This is a gross exaggeration, and that he is good at strategy in general. There are things he is extremely good at, particularly finding ways to insert Russia into international questions while putting fairly small amounts of power on the table, the way he did in Libya, in the Central African Republic, in Syria, and a number of other places. This has been part of a long-term plan to rebuild Russia's presence on the global stage. That's what he's good at. Controlling Ukraine is what he has been very bad at. I want to frame this invasion as the result of 20 years of failed Russian policy, aimed at subordinating Ukraine to Moscow's political control. Putin began this policy more or less the moment he followed Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia, and he built on much less frightening versions of this policy that Yeltsin had followed. Yeltsin had sought to maintain a close relationship with Ukraine. There were good strategic and economic reasons to do so. They were interrelated economies. Their defense infrastructure had been one infrastructure in 1991. And there were things Russia needed that only Ukraine was making for them at the moment the Soviet Union fell apart. So at first, Russian policy sought a form of cooperation. As Putin consolidated his control of Russia in the early 2000s, he extended that effort to consolidate Russian control of Ukraine. And the kind of key moments you can see early on were both in 2004. First, the Russian presidential election, in which Putin resorted to substantial forms of fraud and intimidation to ensure that he would win an overwhelming victory. He was going to win anyway, but he wasn't satisfied with winning. He wanted to establish dominant political power. He tried to do the same thing later in the year in the Ukrainian presidential election. The longtime incumbent was retiring. His preferred candidate to replace him, Yanukovych, had strong support from Putin. Putin introduced him to world leaders as the man who's going to be president of Ukraine. And the election polls in Ukraine over the summer of 2014 didn't seem like Yanukovych was doing very well. His opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, was winning. Putin thought he had a problem with a man. And as a KGB officer, he remembered Stalin's maxim: if your problem is a man, no problem. So he tried to do something which really ought to have been more shocking for the world than it was at the time. He poisoned the leading presidential candidate in the Ukrainian election. And TCDD dioxin, 6,000 times the normal levels, were found in the body of the dying Ukrainian opposition leader who was flown to Europe for emergency treatment. Somewhat miraculously, he lived, which from Putin's perspective was a great tragedy. It turns out he wasn't very happy being poisoned. Shocking. And these Ukrainian leaders don't like to give up, it turns out. Putin doesn't either, though. Yushchenko was campaigning from a hospital bed in Europe for much of the remaining campaign. But on the 1st of October, the election, first round of the elections, he's clearly the leading candidate. Ukrainians use a French-style, well, two-round presidential election, an open primary in the first and a runoff in the second. And Yushchenko and Yanukovych were in the runoff. Yushchenko was clearly winning. So Putin drew on the same allies that helped him poison Yushchenko in the first place and committed massive, blatant electoral fraud. There were districts in eastern Ukraine that had shown a 55% turnout in the first round and landed at 95% turnout in the second. And they managed to keep them all that I'm aware of under 100% turnout, showing a modicum of competence in their electoral fraud. But it was absolutely blatant. Putin expected to get away with it because in Russia, the security services had simply been able to shut down opposition and to electoral fraud. The Ukrainian response, which surprised people at the time, though in retrospect it really doesn't, were mass protests against this blatant effort of a foreign power to control their electoral process. As Putin blames the United States for what became known as the Orange Revolution. And when you hear his speeches, he uses phrases like, the Americans did the Orange Revolution. The Americans made the Orange Revolution. He gives the United States agency in place of what happens in Ukraine. I could talk more about this, but if I do, I'll look stupid because my colleague is a lot better at talking about this. Suffice to say, the protests were sufficient and that the Ukrainian government, against Putin's will, agreed to a new runoff, which Yushchenko wins. And embraces as an opening towards the European Union. Putin doesn't give up, though. He is nothing if not persistent. And for the next 6 years, he runs propaganda and economic attacks against Ukraine, trying to undermine Yushchenko politically, and even more than that, trying to damage the Ukrainian economy to manipulating its energy supplies, to ensure that public opinion would turn against Yushchenko. In 2010, Yanukovych the Putin candidate makes it into the second round of the elections, and Yushchenko doesn't. Instead, Yanukovych faces Yulia Tymoshenko. Oh, for those of you who have been in conservative circles, she was actually a style icon in the international right in the mid 2000s, and she narrowly loses, and Putin has his preferred candidate. But Yanukovych has run on a platform of balancing between Russia and the EU, not picking a side. He said, we're going to be neutral, we're going to work with both the EU and Russia, he told constituents. After disputed 2012 elections in which Yanukovych appears to have engaged in moderate electoral fraud, only moderate though, it's better than what Putin does on his own terms. Yanukovych announces that economically he is withdrawing from association talks with the European Union and turning Ukraine toward Russia economically, seeking an economic alliance. This, together with the fraud, together with the fact that he had done things like put the woman he beat in the election in prison on trumped up charges of treason and fraud and the like, lead to new protests. Notice that each time Putin fails, he tries again, goes further, gets pushback, usually from the Ukrainians. And the result is Euromaidan and the second of the Ukrainian revolutions against Putin's efforts to control the country. Putin doesn't give up. He responds on the assumption that the Ukrainian state is fragile and the removal of his candidate will be seen as illegitimate. So he turns to force. If you can't control the politics, you can break Ukraine into pieces with military force. He grabs Crimea using the infamous Little Green Men Russian troops not wearing Russian insignia with a single coat of paint covering the Russian coat of arms on their military equipment. The United States pretended for a couple days we didn't understand what was happening in a lamentable display by the US government. When that doesn't bring down the Ukrainian state, he had expected that there would be a kind of revolution following this. He sponsors small militias in parts of Ukraine and to revolt in the name of Russia and sends in Russian troops, again, not wearing insignia and painting over their equipment, to occupy parts of Ukraine, which is how we end up with the low intensity conflict. Putin assumed Ukraine would buckle, that there would be more revolt, that region by region would collapse. Instead, he found himself caught in 8 years of trench warfare, like World War I style trench warfare on the Ukrainian-Russian frontier, well, the line of contact. When his efforts to escalate this have routinely failed, the Ukrainians have held. I would like you to think of this in recent escalation as the latest escalation out of failure of Putin's policies. The ominous thing to think about is that there is no particular reason why he will stop escalating out of failure if this operation doesn't work out the way he anticipated, either because the Ukrainians stop him with a lot of help, or because it doesn't get him what he expected, even if he occupies the country.
Dr. Smirnova?
Thanks, Andrew and Jeff. Well, I guess I want to start with just a quick note before we delve into this big geopolitical narratives that people are on the ground, and people are suffering, and I happen to have a deep connection to the story because my mother is in Ukraine, from Western Ukraine, my father is from Russia, where as of today or yesterday, we have lost the last remnants of independent media. So even the general news or the things we're discussing today are just not getting into the actual people's papers or minds. So it's really hard. So you have to always remember. But however, I'm still going to continue with big geopolitical narratives. And I want to just highlight some geopolitical facets of this conflict. And I want to pull up that picture, if that's possible. I'm sorry for bossing around, but just to start with the picture, that is a bit, yeah. There you go. Well, this is the main map that has been circulating on the Russian national television, as we know of today that most of the Russian media is state-owned. So this map shows the quote-unquote actual map of Ukraine. And on here you will see what you think of Ukraine is not what the Russian public now thinks of Ukraine. The actual Ukraine there is a yellow island in the middle, while the rest is portrayed, the yellow island comes from 1654, while the rest is portrayed as the present from Khrushchev in 1954, which is Crimea, which used to be a Russian domain prior to 54. The present from Lenin, which is the Novorossiya region, the orange part of the Black Sea coast. Then you have the present of the Russian Tsars, of course. Who can even define those borders anymore because they were so arbitrary at that time. And of course, the presence from Stalin on the left in the dark orange or red part. So Putin has been really threatening Ukrainian sovereignty, and not so much threatening, but actually denying to recognize Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. As I quote, he called Ukraine as a Bolshevik creation without a tradition of statehood. Based on this map that was portrayed on all national television, the speech was justifying the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk as independent republics, the borders of which have already superseded and they're actually bigger than the actually separatist-controlled areas, which are only 1/3 of the area of Donetsk and Lugansk region. So this is the start, right, of the territorial expansion. So Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, and here I quote again Vladimir Putin, with really not much room for the Ukrainian territorial sovereignty to exist. Putin has claimed multiple times, and in 2005, he said that I do recognize, quote unquote, new geopolitical realities of the fall Soviet Union and the new borders. However, Ukraine is an exception. So if you look at Putin's narrative this time, his idea of sovereignty also changes, right? From this Westphalian territorial borders and interference into each other's domain, Putin sees territorial sovereignty as a metaphor for the inner energy of the people that are united by common values, common history, and common beliefs, etc. And in fact, if you look at the recent CNN poll, we see that 64% of Russians think of themselves and Ukrainians as one nation, as one people, but only 28% of Ukrainians think of themselves as one people with the Russians, as one union, one nation, or one sovereignty in Putin's mind. So Putin claimed recently in the most recent speech, I'm confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful. We are one people. So this Russians' love for the expansive, massive state obviously comes from a long tragedy, a long geopolitical tragedy. For example, after 91, Russia, the Soviet Union has lost 24% of its territory. And also there are other territorial tragedies that President Putin keeps citing. For example, Brest-Litovsk agreement in 1918 that forced Russia to cede most of its domains. For example, like Georgia, Ukraine, Finland, giving up Poland, giving up all Baltic states to the to end the World War I. So in that time, Russia has lost 1 million square miles of its former territory, and also 50% or 55% of its population, as well as the majority of resources such as coal and oil and iron, so much present in the Donbas region. So this hyper-nationalist rhetoric, as we see in Russia, very heavily nationalist, comes along with the idea of territorial expansion. Territory and nationalism in Russia are one, and there's a long history to that. So this very much allows Putin to deny territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, and I won't speculate, but probably other post-Soviet nations as well, although again, it's also speculations and real people are suffering as we speak of big geopolitics here. But land, what is now Ukraine, is very much dear to the Russian people and Putin in particular for two reasons, as he claims, of course, the birth of Christianity in the Kievan Rus in 1988, where Prince Volodymyr brought in Christianity from Byzantine Empire, but also Catherine the Great's aspirations in the Ottoman Empire region in 1700s, in the idea of Novorossiya, right, the new Russia, which the separatist groups in Donbas and Lugansk have taken up as their major slogan for claiming their separation from Ukraine. So sentimental Novorossiya has become the major word for people chanting on the streets. Often we don't even know if those are actual probably Russians moved to Donbas and Lugansk with the Russian flags flying above. There was a funny story when they put Russian flags on the theater and not on the regional administration, because they just didn't know where the regional administration was in Donbas, because they were just across the street from one another. And as you know, Soviet architecture, they all kind of look the same. So yes, there are some stories like that. But to quote Putin one more time, he says, I would like to remind you that what was called Novorossiya, or the New Russia, back in the Tsarist days, the center of that territory was Novorossiysk, right, and not Kiev. So the region is called Novorossiya. Russians lost those territories for various reasons, but the people remained. And yes, indeed, the people remained because during Catherine the Great's rule, many Russians were resettled in that region, right? Also to fulfill the gap and the hole in just essentially to reinforce the border is peopling it by the Russians and not the Crimean Khanate and the Mongol and the Turkic-related communities. So yes, Novorossiya is one of those big staples of Russian nationalism today. So what is the major outcome of this imperial geopolitical narrative that Russian Putin, it's important to say Putin, right? Russians are protesting currently on the streets. 7,500 people are currently detained in Russia for protesting against the war. But Putin doesn't agree, right? And he claims that Ukrainians have to take power in their own hands. And here I quote, we have to, it looks like it will be easier for us to come to an agreement with you than with this gang of drug addicts. This is a new narrative. I don't know where it's coming from. And the neo-Nazis who lodged themselves in Kiev and took the entire Ukrainian people hostage. But yet Ukrainian people have successfully disagreed with that statement and currently doing a very good job fighting. So yes, this is my contribution to the big geopolitics picture.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Martinez-Mashine?
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, well, thanks also to both of my colleagues. So I think I've given a great background of Russia's history and politics. And I think what I would like to speak to now is something that is also on our minds, which is what has the US response been? What has NATO's response been? Other European states? And what are some possibilities for the future as well? So those of us who study foreign policy often think about it as a menu of choices, right? So it's not just that you have to choose one action, you have several open to you and you can basically pick and choose, mix and match, right? And so far we've seen the US and NATO select some of those and also discuss a few of those and a few others as well. And so that's what I'd like to see. So one option that I think both President Biden as well as most recently the NATO alliance as well as a whole have been very clear about, at least as of now, taking off the table, is that of deploying US troops or NATO troops to Ukraine. They have explicitly said they won't do it, right? Why at the same time are they also deploying, for example, US troops to other countries in Eastern Europe, into the Baltics, to Poland? So the biggest reason for this is Ukraine is not a NATO member. The Baltic countries, Poland, all are, right? And so that really matters in terms of placing troops, right? Basically, once one of the NATO countries is attacked by someone else, is invaded, it could invoke Article 5, which means that an attack on that country is an attack on the rest of the alliance, which obligates the rest of the alliance to defend them, right? And so in a way, what the US is doing by placing its troops in the Baltic states, right? Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, in Poland, it's basically setting up a tripwire that is emphasizing its commitment to the alliance, right? If Putin kept the invasion going past Ukraine into any one of these countries, US troops would be put at risk, which then is that tripwire, which would trigger a US intervention, also presumably a NATO intervention, right? So the US is placing troops to emphasize that commitment, to basically tie their hands that they would get involved in this setting, but they've also emphasized that Ukraine is not a NATO member and that they're not at this point willing to escalate the conflict to that degree. Now, another point that has been brought up is the idea of a no-fly zone, right? President Zelensky has actually called for one. There are many people in the media who have discussed this point. And so what is a no-fly zone, right? Because I think that this term can be a little bit fuzzy. And so I figured it made sense to talk a little bit about what it is. A no-fly zone basically means that you control the airspace in a given region. And so in this case, it would be Ukraine. how do you control the airspace? You do it in two ways. One, you shoot down the opponent's airplanes, right, that are flying over that area. And second, you also have to take out the opponent's air defenses, right? Because if your own planes are operating in the area, taking out the opponent's planes, you don't want your own planes shot down, right? So you have to both take down the opponent's airplanes and their air defenses. That's a big thing to do, right? And so the reason why the US and NATO have said so far no to a no-fly zone is because it's essentially engaging in combat with Russia. And this is something that so far they have wanted to avoid. And so that's the reason behind it. Something that both the US and the European countries have done is impose sanctions on Russia. Something big to keep in mind about those sanctions is that at this point, they're no longer deterrent sanctions. They're no longer trying to keep Putin from doing something. They're compelling sanctions. They're trying to get him to stop doing something that he's already doing. And so the thing about sanctions is that if we observe a sanction, we already know that its probability of working is lower than if we hadn't observed it. The best sanctions we don't observe because they work at the threat stage, right? And so already we're at the point where these are harder sanctions to actually compel Putin to do something. So what has the US and Europe done? So first of all, they started by targeting certain Russian financial institutions, certain oligarchs, certain members of the Russian elites who are essential for Putin to stay in power. They have then moved on to also cutting Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, which I think a lot of us has heard about. And so in terms of what is it, I think a lot of Americans aren't as familiar with it because, you know, this is a big country and so we're not as used to carrying out international transactions. But one way to think about it is almost like the routing number that you have on your checks in your bank, right? And so you provide that when you're enrolling for payroll, something like that. It's almost like that, but it's for international transactions. So it's a system that allows financial transactions to happen internationally much more easily. It doesn't mean that they can't happen without SWIFT, but it's much more burdensome. And so that is a big problem. Most recently, the biggest escalation in sanctions that the US has carried out is imposing sanctions against the Russian central bank. This is big, right? They're not unprecedented. It's not that the US has never done this against other countries. It certainly has against Iran, Syria, Venezuela, kind of a circle of baddies in the international system. But it is very important. Why is it important when the Russian central bank is sanctioned? It's because the Russian central bank can no longer access its foreign exchange reserves that it holds, for example, in the US, right? Why is that a problem if you're the Russian central bank? Because you need those foreign exchange reserves to protect the ruble against depreciation, right? So when there's this conflict happening in Ukraine, what you're seeing is a lot of foreign investors going out and getting rid of their Russian assets, right? Which means that they're selling off their rubles and buying dollars and other things. Now, this what the central bank could do at that point in order to protect the ruble is basically take its foreign reserves and buy back some of those rubles, right? To protect against depreciation. It can't do that without accessing those foreign reserves, right? In addition, the Central Bank of Russia can't do business with individuals or with businesses in these countries that are sanctioned. And so that means that it's losing access to one other foreign policy option, which is being able to sell its gold reserves, right? Which is something else it could do in order to get, let's say, dollars, right? To buy other things that it needs. And so now this puts the Russian central bank in a position where if it wants to sell its gold, it essentially has to do it on the black market, which it could do. China, I'm sure, would be likely to buy some of that gold, but it is limiting its options. That's where we are now. Sanctions could still continue to escalate. So they're already in a bad place. They could get worse. The US could place secondary sanctions on Russia, so sanctions on people who violate the sanctions and continue to do business with Russia. It could also take away the exception that is currently in place for Russian gas and oil. So the US and European countries haven't cut off Russian gas and oil, so that's still one source of foreign currency for the Russians. That is still something that they could do to escalate. That would, of course, drive up the prices of gas and oil in the US and especially in Europe, right? And we're still using heating, we're still traveling, that's going to matter. So we probably could expect oil and gas prices to go up. They already are going up even more. Also importantly, I think one thing that, and especially, you know, we as people who are in Kansas who are very aware of this as well, grain prices. We should be expecting grain prices to go up. Both Russia and Ukraine are producers and exporters of grain, and that actually may take even longer than gas and oil prices to recover, right? Because grain isn't something that you just extract and sell out. If farmers have abandoned their farms, if some of them are destroyed, some of the crop is destroyed, that just can't recover immediately. So it's certainly something that could affect world hunger as well. We of course may see the protests increase after the costs of these sanctions begin to take place. Other options, we're seeing legionnaires traveling to Ukraine. We can talk about what the difference is between a legionnaire and a mercenary or a contractor if you want during the Q&A. We're seeing arms transfers happening to Ukraine. And something else to keep in mind is in terms of what will happen with regards to foreign policy from the US and the EU towards Russia is the effect of Putin targeting civilians intentionally, right? That is something that can definitely drive public opinion against them, and that could also lead to more calls for active action. So we'll certainly discuss that a lot more in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. General Myers.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for letting me sit on this panel. This is a distinguished panel. I feel like an interloper here, but I'll add my 3 cents. A little bit of personal perspective. So in the mid-90s, I was, one of my jobs was to hang around the State Department as a 3-star. And it was a time when Russia was making a lot of noise about not expanding. Of course, the wall had fallen. Russia was still trying to get its feet under themselves. They were nervous about NATO expansion, the same old paranoia that you already heard about. And so we worked on something called the NATO-Russian Charter. And there was a group in Washington that did that. It required lots of quick trips to Moscow to try to work with the Russians, then go through Brussels to explain to NATO what we're doing. The US had the lead on this for the most part, but NATO had to go along with it. And I would say it was fairly productive, and then we came up with a NATO-Russian charter. Actually, the Russian government and military had offices in Brussels. We were looking, they're not ever going to become members of NATO, but we were looking for a way to continue the coordination, the communications in a much more friendly way. And I was involved in those. If you've, I don't know, some of you may have, but if you've ever negotiated with the Russians in Moscow in winter, it's a pretty depressing experience, actually. People are great. Russian people are great. But some of these negotiators are really smart. They're going to stay on their point, and they're never going to leave it. And you leave the room thinking, I don't think we got anywhere today. And that's what they wanted to have happen. Then you go back to your very, this is before the, 800th anniversary of Moscow or whatever, where they painted everything and made it beautiful. This was before that. Was it 800? What was it? I can't remember the anniversary that they decided to revive the city. So that's a kind of one point. That resulted in a summit in Helsinki, Finland, between President Clinton and Yeltsin, and they formalized this. It had other dimensions to it. It had the outline of a new START treaty, I think it was, for nuclear arms reductions, and it had something you don't care, very esoteric, but had a thing in there about theater missile defense. The Russians didn't want us to bring defenses into Europe that could shoot down short-range missiles because they could also be used for long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. So we had to come up with a speed limit that everybody could agree on our missiles. Really crazy stuff. But then in the 2000s, under President Bush, when I was basically vice chairman and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there was a big push to develop better relations with Russia in the early 2000s. And we worked really, really hard on that. And they got really good. I don't know how many times I visited Russia, and Mary Jo, on several occasions, we went to Russia. I've flown in a MiG-29 in Russia from one of their secret base. I flew a MiG-27 My last trip there, right before I retired from the military, I mean, we had really close relations. We were starting to bring Russian soldiers to Garmisch, Germany, where our NCO school is, to start helping them develop a middle management, an NCO corps, which they do not have. They have conscripts and generals in Russia, basically, and they don't have the middle management piece that the Western forces rely on. So we're trying to start that as well. Well, that fell on hard times. Putin came into power, I think, in May of 2012. That fell on hard times. And so that progress, I was called actually out of when I was retired. Hey, could you meet with your former Russian counterpart? Because this is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the current chairman. He said, could you do that? Because I have no contact with the current guy. But maybe in this meeting in Germany, maybe you could go meet with your former guy and make a little progress here, because relations just started to tail off. And I think we are now seeing that's just that keeps playing out. But this was all, I don't know if it was a grand strategy on Putin's part, but it started when Putin came to power. Things really, in the Obama administration, if you remember, our relations with Russia were bad and getting worse, and they just continued. I think something's a little different in this particular case for the U.S. We had really good intelligence what Russia was up to, really good intelligence. And when you heard President Biden said, they're going in, they're going in, they're going in, he wasn't just saying that to stir the pot. He knew, he knew what was happening, and it really frustrated Putin that all his schemes would then play out in the press, because what we very seldom do in the U.S. is release any intelligence we have, because it then could hurt our sources and methods of obtaining that intelligence. But I think in an attempt to say, hey, we know what you're up to and we know it's serious. So President Biden wasn't just trying to stir the pot. He was reflecting what he understood from our intelligence, but turned out to be pretty accurate what was going to go on. By the way, I take this all from public sources. I have no, I don't, but pretty good public sources actually. The Russian military has always been a blunt instrument of force, reckless even. And you see that, you just turn on TV today, what they do, they lob something in artillery shells into a nuclear power plant complex. I mean, it takes real recklessness to even think about that. So adherence to the law of armed conflict, which kind of came out of World War II, and everybody's recklessness in World War II, and exposing many civilians to the millions of deaths, actually. When I was chairman, when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we agonized over civilian casualties all the time. And there were 3 levels of approval. The commander over those conflicts out of Central Command had 1 level of authority. The next level was the Secretary of Defense, and the next level, the final level, was the president. And they were all appropriate. And we would sometimes say no, we would sometimes say yes, based on the corresponding damage to either buildings or civilians that should not be in the conflict. But the Russians, that's not what they don't worry about that at all. Which I think, at least my last conclusion here, and this is just an opinion on my part, and if the Russians want to continue in this very sort of sloppy military operation, it looks so uncoordinated. I'm guessing that it's a lot like Saddam Hussein, who said, well, the Americans and their allies will never come into Iraq. Well, we did, and they were caught with their pants down. I think the Russian army says, well, we're never going to do this, this is, and now they're there, and they haven't got the logistics infrastructure in place. They can do that very quickly. They're right there. They can do that. So I would think, and if they're going to be reckless, and if they're going to be ruthless, I think they could, if they want to eventually prevail over a Ukrainian military, which has got the heart and soul and the good morale right now, but they could get worn down by the brutality of what I think we've already seen a lot of, and we'll see, I think, a lot more. So the Russian military could prevail, not on the moral grounds, probably not politically. I don't think they'll ever win the hearts of the Ukrainian people, but they could prevail militarily and make it a longer slog. I don't know if anybody on this panel, have you seen the Atlantic Council, sort of the 4 possible outcomes? The Atlantic Council kind of give these 4 possible outcomes, and I'll just go over them. It might be something we can talk about here, but And this is going to be very cryptic because I know I have a limited time. One outcome is Ukraine wins, but the resistance just wins, and Putin says it's not worth all this, the sanctions and all the heat that he's taking internally, externally, making them a pariah state. Maybe so. I want to get away. This is not that important. It's important, but I'll figure another way to do this. And so Ukraine wins, and it's over and done with. I think that's. Well, you figure out where you think it is. The next is the quagmire, where Russia does install a puppet regime. Ukraine keeps up an insurgency, helped by Western nations and its neighbors. But after probably years and a lot of violence and a lot of death, Russia says it's just not, this isn't worth it. And Putin's worried about his prestige at home, so he goes back, they pull out so Putin can build up his image on the world stage in Russia. The third one is the Iron Curtain, where Russia takes control of the country through their heavy-handed tactics and the weapons superiority they have. And he's able to solidify, Putin's able to solidify his position at home. And NATO has, as Carla talked about, there are very limited options NATO has unless you want to confront Russia directly. Even a no-fly zone, as she pointed out, does that. So that would be an Iron Curtain, a long standoff, and probably resistance, but that's the Iron Curtain mode, which they've done before, we know. And the last one is the NATO-Russian war. Which, could be precipitated by a no-fly zone and direct conflict between NATO and Russian forces, or mistakes by Russian forces, where they lob stuff into Poland or some of the other countries, and you don't know if it's an attack or not, but you have to respond. And so you respond with force, and then pretty soon things potentially escalate beyond your control. So those were the four sort of bounding conditions that the Atlantic Council, and this is what they focus on. Atlantic Council focuses on Europe and things NATO, and a lot of the people there are former ambassadors, former military that have served their careers in that part of the world. So I think those are actually, they're probably, it's an inexhaustible list of potential options, but that kind of thing. And I think I'll just leave it there, and we'll stand by for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, General Myers. It's not a very uplifting set of end game scenarios, but I think that's where we are.
Can I give you an uplifting? Let me give you one uplifting. Okay, so here's the uplifting piece. So there was a piece in the Council on Foreign Relations, of which I'm a member. There's a guy there, Stuart M. Patrick, put out in his blog. I don't know if anybody read it. He said there's some outcomes here that are not all bad. Now, none of us understand what Ukrainians are going through right now. I mean, we had a glimpse when Afghanistan fell apart and families were put on the march. They left home with whatever they could carry on their back. That's happening in Ukraine. Plus, there's active war going on, and innocent women and children and men are dying. So with that as backdrop, and that's unacceptable, just absolutely unacceptable. But what Patrick would say, revived Western solidarity. It certainly has done that, at least temporarily, hopefully permanently. Re-energized U.S. global leadership. It's been lacking for quite a while. It turns out that if you want to work on problems like this, the U.S. has to be involved. Other countries will tell you that, most other countries will. It catalyzed European integration. So now we have Finland and Sweden thinking about joining NATO, we're told. And then it's exposed Russia's weaknesses, the hollowness of their pretensions that this is their land. I mean, we're countering pretty well, at least outside of Russia, some of these propaganda we hear from inside Russia, which they're very good at it. So, I mean, I think those are some positives, but it still leaves us with this conflict, which is horrible. I'm shutting up, sorry. Don't say the word, take off.
Okay, now we'll open up things up for questions. For people on Zoom, you can post your questions on the chat, and Dr. Sam Bell, head of political science, has kindly agreed to retrieve those and ask those. So, and remember, I'm going to try to paraphrase and restate your questions for the folks watching live. So questions? Yes.
Okay, so as been mentioned, but I just saw prediction speculation. What's China doing right now? What's their see on this? Because China and both Xi and Putin are pretty getting closer. Can you make any predictions or estimation, speculation about what they're looking at this? You know, they're saying, well, we should probably go into Taiwan right now, but can you some perspectives on what China's maybe thinking or action they may be taking in relation to this?
So the question is how the current events in Ukraine are influencing China, and I'm interpreting if perhaps China might take advantage of some of the situation with regards to Taiwan. And
I'll say something. I think, there was a bromance going on between Putin and Xi for a while. I think that's cool. I don't think there are any love letters going back and forth at this particular moment. China abstained on the vote in the UN Security Council to condemn this. Part of their philosophy is the sovereignty of nations and non-intervention. And Russia has just violated that. So if they were to condemn it and vote no, for instance, they would be being hypocritical to their own philosophy. And I think they've also seen what happens when you act in this manner in the world. And China, I think we can predict, will be very aggressive, but I don't think it means, I think they would have to calculate that if this were to happen, if they were to make a move on Taiwan, there would be a lot of sanction-like activity. I mean, the economic impact would be huge, much bigger than the economic, in my view, and I'm not the expert, at least you all are experts, but I think the economic impact would be a lot larger if China did something like that and sanctions were imposed. I mean, it would be, U.S. would have to react to it in some way. I don't know what that way would be, but in some way. And I think and China doesn't need a big economic shock right now. They're at their own struggles. So I think, who knows? We don't know. But I think there's reason to think that China is probably in a wait and watch mode right now.
so one question I had on China was, and I thought, I can't remember the details, will they potentially be a backstop for Moscow with regard to these sanctions? Will they help to blunt the impact of these sanctions? I think they've done something, but I can't recall what. Is it?
Yeah, they want to buy some grain.
Okay. Andrew, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say some long-term things about China, about the effect of this for China's grand strategy. For China, I think it would be, I think it would be really reckless and squander on potential opportunities for them if they strike at Taiwan this afternoon. I know there was some fear when the power grid failed in parts of Taiwan that this was a cyber beginning. But from China's perspective, the more the United States has to engage in the defense of Europe, the less America can be engaged as the balancing power against China and Asia. So for them, the smart play is to sit back, do what you can a little bit to keep Russia from melting down or doing something really dumb like throwing a tac nuke around or something. And they lost thermobaric weapons on the battlefield. There are options for what Russian soldiers can do when they're desperate. But for China, they're more likely to try and sort of keep the temperature in East Asia somewhat steady in the near term, hoping to see the U.S. pivot fully into Europe. Russia's going to try and rely on China for some support, but that raises strategic problems that run against long-term Russian policy in Asia. Russia has consciously chosen not to integrate Siberia into the Chinese market, even though they could make a lot of money doing it. Because when Putin looks at China, what he sees is the potential for millions of migrants into Siberia, changing the ethnic balance of Russian territory and creating border problems with Chinese nationalism. So he'll rely on that, but he's going to have some problems pulling off a long-term alignment economically to China. Having said that, you know, I'm more accurate looking backwards and forwards. You know, Xi's made some serious mistakes geopolitically in the last 2 years, squandering China's goodwill up and down East Asia. And you know, Japan, for instance, is signaling really hard to China right now that in a move on Taiwan, the Japanese fleet needs to be taken into account by Chinese planners. They pretend they don't have aircraft carriers in Japan, but they have a bunch of ships that look a lot like aircraft carriers to me, and some of them are named after Japanese ships that bombed Pearl Harbor. So, you know, China might want to consider what its neighbors would do at that moment.
I also think China is essentially keeping an almost neutral-ish position right now. So we know that they have a very strong economic relationship with Russia, right? And so I do think that if Russia starts selling gold on the black market, it'll be to China, right? You know, they're importing grain, they're importing all sorts of things. So there's going to be a source, an economic source of income for Russia. I think, you know, there is always a possibility that some of these sanctions become secondary ones, right? At which point China and China's businesses would be in a more difficult position, right? Because then they would have to decide, you know, are we defying these sanctions that the US and other countries have imposed on Russia? And that would be a trickier question. In terms of, you know, are they going to move in on Taiwan? You know, I think the question we would ask ourselves is, you know, why would invasion be contagious at this point, right? And some could say, well, it's Russia breaking this norm of territorial integrity, or, you know, maybe Western countries are distracted, but, you know, it's still a war between Russia and Ukraine. We don't have foreign militaries fighting with them. And so I think I agree with Andrew that to me seems unlikely right now.
Okay, and so we'll pivot to an online question.
And so there are quite a few questions online. I'm just going to take them in order so the folks on Zoom hear that I'm being fair, but there are a lot of interest. So one question is, what is the role of broader Slavic identity in this conflict, specifically interactions on the ground between soldiers and civilians? And so it seems, I think there are probably a few people on this panel that can speak to this question.
So the people on Zoom, we're going to take the questions in order. We're also going to take questions from the audience. And what is the role of broader Slavic identity, particularly in relations between soldiers and citizens?
Yeah, it's a tough question because sometimes when Slavic identity comes as useful, then yes, it is full force and everybody together, we're all brothers. But then when Slavic identity comes as the point of border division, then no, we're, you know, it's been very much again used by Putin and other nationalist circles to either side with Ukraine and with the people, and then also portray the Ukrainian government as not the Ukrainian people, which is hard to say because Zelensky has received more than 70% of the vote. So it's been very masterfully, I say, used by Putin and others to just rotate population's opinion about the Slavic identity. And Russia also is playing this very dangerous game with being a Eurasian identity as well, which comes in with all the Turkic and Mongol and also other identities and ethnicities together. So that is another refuge for Russian nationalism, is Eurasia. That's where China comes as a threat too. So yeah, they are there, those identities, but the use of those discourses very masterfully by a very important circle of people has been successfully just directing people against each other, against their own Slavic neighbor. Yeah.
So these identities are layers and they can be used depending on the context.
Just the cards, yeah.
Wonderful. Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi. So my big question, we've been talking about this, and we saw a little bit with the question about China, where, you know, there's more than one pole, right? It's no longer, you know, East bloc, like Com bloc versus the West, right? So, and we're looking forward, say, let's look forward 40 years from now, right? We know that, for example, Brazil has also claimed neutrality. India seems to be trying to suss out its options. What we're looking at a war where diplomacy is now more multipolar, right? Where it's not so easy to build these large alliance blocks. How do you guys see global politics playing out? Do you see almost like return to 19th century imperial politics, or how does the 21st century version of a multipolar imperial conflict and debate look like?
So the question is, how does this impact the future and polarity in the international system? And some major players like Brazil and India have been neutral in this conflict. And does that portend a greater multipolarity similar to the 19th century and potentially multipolar conflict?
I'll jump in first, while you guys. So it's what I find interesting is that I think, you know, before the start of this year, we really have been talking about a bipolar world with the US and China, right? And so that's where our interest was. And then I think this really shifted our way of thinking. You know, it's not that Russia suddenly became much more powerful, but that violating this norm against territorial integrity, right, and against sovereignty that hadn't been violated in years to this degree against invasion, it shifted our way of thinking of how Russia would use its power. And so, you know, I think Michael and I, the way we started talking about this in our co-author work, is we're thinking about it as competitive consent, right, where you have different countries that have, yes, all this hard power, and we knew it was there, but I think we're likely to see a competition for soft power as well, right? So the US will maybe no longer be the only country that has military bases, right? We're seeing, you know, China has one in Djibouti, one looking for its place on Equatorial Guinea, right? And so we're seeing also a move towards competition for persuading others to be on your side. And this is somewhere where I think, you know, in a way, the way that Russia is losing that kind of PR battle would be one way to think about this as basically another realm in competition in the future.
So I'm going to jump on that just a little bit and to build on General Meyer's comments. And I'm not a historian, although I'm very uncomfortable with predictions. So, I would say, for me, it's amazing how we've rallied around liberal ideas and democracy. It looked like for such a long time that the Western world was shaky, that the foundations were being challenged. But I think when we see a true autocrat challenge a defenseless nation, and in terms of the information war, Ukraine's been masterful. I talked to people at the School of Advanced Military Studies and Command and General Staff College yesterday, and they said, it's over. That when Putin's talking about Nazis in Ukraine and Ukraine having nuclear weapons, all credibility is gone. The information war is completely done. But when we see these threats, the coalition or the coalescing of the Western world has just been amazing. And I think that has an impact in the future as well. And the value, going back to soft power, the impact of these ideas, when we see them challenged and potentially stomped out in a brutal fashion, we are rallying around, or many people in the world are rallying around these ideas. And we see legionnaires volunteering and going into Ukraine, similar to the Spanish Civil War. Let's pivot back to online questions.
All right. So there are a few questions I'll kind of summarize as, and I promise I'm not just making up my own questions. I have lots of them, and I could be doing that, but not. There are a few questions that sort of revolve around the idea of there's questions about sort of the possibility of witnessing a coup, and sort of what, or a more popular revolt that might sort of overthrow Putin. And so there are a lot of people have questions about sort of the domestic politics, how this might affect the domestic politics of Russia, the prospects of a coup, the prospects of maybe a more popular revolt against the current government.
So just repeating for the everyone on Zoom, the question is about domestic politics within Russia. If perhaps the sanctions or the events on the ground will lead to a coup or to a greater protest, how it impacts Russia moving forward.
Yes, I could reflect on that. What's fascinating is that we've been thinking this is going to be the end of Putin, right, forever, but at such a cost. But it might lead to that until, I guess, yesterday when they did shut down the last independent media. And there is one interesting point going on around, and it is again speculation amongst the Russian political analysts on Telegram, right? So the only way to follow them is that Putin might start up a military, a Marshall Plan, which would mean all the power goes to the hands of the president, all the media is shut down, only one single channel with official propaganda is displayed. All the there has been a recent law, actually, an amendment to a law approved yesterday, saying that if you portray the special operation as a war and not as a special operation, you might go to jail for up to 15 years, right? So all this understanding of us, maybe this is finally the end of Putin, it's just crashed in front of our eyes in the past 2 days. It's just shutting down of all the opportunities for the Russian people themselves to see the truth. And so the recent poll by Levada Center, which is the only center we can rely on for fair polling, has showed that in fact 62 or 64% of Russians think that this escalation is primarily a fault of the US and NATO. And only 4% of Russians think that this is the fault of Russia. So just terrifying, and this poll was conducted maybe 5 days ago or so, right? So that we have no idea if this share has changed, but so far it has been only the opportunities to see the real information online has been diminishing. So in terms of the domestic situation, it's extremely sad, and the sanctions are going to hit Russians very hard. The produce is already 11% more expensive. The inflation is already about 9%, and the information access is almost zero. So yeah, the prospects are not great for that.
Okay, so I'm going to be the glass half full person again. And not an expert on Russia, but political scientists study of authoritarian regimes, especially opaque authoritarian regimes such as Russia is now, I would argue. You often don't see the fall before it comes if there's some kind of elite unrest or elite movement against the leader, and the fall can be sudden. But we can't see that because Putin is so isolated and it has so much control over information, which actually, I'm going to take a point of whatever. I fear I would love some comments on the type of information Putin is receiving, because history is littered with leaders who receive politicized information and were surrounded by yes men and women and sycophants, and how that led to disasters. And I fear that Putin is becoming more and more isolated. Do you have any?
Yes, you can see this so clearly when you watch a video of Putin speaking to the head of intelligence. If anybody has seen this, because I tell you to go on YouTube and see it, it's just full humiliation. The way Narishkin is just absolutely mortified. He looked terrified, right? Because he also didn't expect this to happen. The head of the intelligence didn't expect this to happen. So his own inner circle is seeing that it is in fact predominantly Putin and maybe Shoigu, the Ministry of Defense, right? Predominantly maybe it's their doing, but yes, the closest people to him haven't seen this coming, as what I hear from.
And I think to your point, that's if there's going to be any action against Putin, it won't be from mobs in the street. It'll be from that inner circle, and there may be some George Washington DNA in some of those folks that say, this is more important than Putin. This is about Russia, its future, and they may see a different option than the one that he's. So it could. Yeah. That's what you said, I think.
Part of our problem is that Jeff said they're so opaque. We no longer, the half empty side is, I'm not sure that elite's there anymore. Is that we sometimes have this image of Russia stuck from the 90s, where it's like the oligarchs, like putting a lot of effort into sanctioning oligarchs. I don't think the oligarchs have any political power in Russia anymore. I think we remember how they ran things under Yeltsin. They're still there, but it doesn't mean they have control of anything. And there, at least 15 years ago, there was a strong layer of kind of intelligence, military people around Putin. They might still be there, in which case Jeff's point is there's hope that they might push hard enough saying we're losing too many men, the system could crack. But there are lots of examples from Russian history where people thought that layer was there. And it turns out it wasn't there. And it was just the guy in charge, in which case, so long as the security services are loyal, the guy in charge stays guy in charge. And Russia goes forward doing whatever they have to do to grind whatever's in front of them until they meet a counterforce. Now, I'm not saying that's happening because I don't know. I have no idea if that elite is still there. I just know I can't see it anymore. Whether that's because it's so cloudy that they're there and beneath the surface, or if it's because they've been pushed out over time and replaced by people who are creatures of Putin. I mean, there's a line in Russia right now about the kind of economic people who show up on TV. They're not oligarchs, they just work as oligarchs. Because they've been, they remember it used to be these independent power brokers. And now they're kind of state appointees or old intelligence buddies of Putin who appear on TV as if they're oligarchs. And they no longer have that independent power base. That's the worrisome possibility. I pray he falls, literally every day. I pray that Putin falls, then Ukraine gets its miracle.
So
To
we,
make a quick note of what Andrew was saying, I think that it's also important to distinguish between the oligarchs who have all these foreign holdings, right? The ones who own Chelsea and the yachts and that, and then also the political and military, not anymore. But right, making a difference between those and the military and political elites, right? And so harming these, the yacht people, is not the same as the military, whose assets are in Russia. It's not that they don't have some nice stuff, but they're in Russia, and so they're not going to be affected in the same way as the people with foreign holdings.
But also, just a quick note, all these people actually came to the circle. The circle has completely changed, right? In 2004, we can say, yes, this is a new circle of new elites that nobody have ever seen before. Shoigu comes out of blue, right? He's just the head of this small little fraction party that Putin absorbs into United Russia. And others so too. Like, they're not new people, they're actually pretty old, bizarre appointees by Putin to replace the Yeltsin's elite. But yes, they don't own Chelsea anymore, and they want to donate money to the Ukrainian opposition. And yes, the mood has been changing inside the circles too.
so it's amazing. We probably had more clarity during the Cold War when we could see who was standing next to Brezhnev on the May Day parade and get some sense of who has influence. So a question from the audience?
There was a lot of talk before the invasion about waiting for the ground troops. Obviously, a lot of mud, and it seems to be a lot of tanks and vehicles kind of broke down. You guys just talk about a little bit how the climate's affecting operations and where we're going to kind of see based on what the climate's going to change in the spring.
So the question is, with the climate, the seasons changing and mud, will that limit or impact military operations in Ukraine? I'll have a follow-up
I can
question.
talk about what happened in World War II. And if it buys General Myers some time to think about something more, more apropos of today. Okay. There are some geographical features of Ukraine which have historically shaped combat at different times of year. One of the challenges Russia has moving from north to south, because they seem to want to come out of Belarus quite badly on multiple axes, is that you're going through the marshes. In World War II, whether it was the German invasion or the Soviet counter-offensives, you went around northern Ukraine, southern Belarus, because those are the Pripyat marshes, and they're not impassable. We learned that from World War II, nothing's impassable, but it's hard. And in a world where your enemy has man-portable anti-tank weapons, and you probably don't want to just drive single file through a marsh and hope that it's all going to be okay. So, so long as the weather hasn't hit hard freeze, that's making it difficult, that's creating problems in the north. Historically, there were 2 times of year where rains and melt obstructed operations. And the spring thaw is a problem for motorized equipment historically in warfare in Ukraine. And the Russians got around that a little bit in World War II with all those American Dodge trucks, but they don't seem to be much more capable right now of moving off-road. This might be one of the reasons that they don't seem to have a lot of control away from main roads in areas that they've occupied. Operating on secondary roads is a problem. One tank drives down a road, it just drives down a road. 30 tanks drive down a road, the road doesn't look like it used to in a lot of places. So, the lack of hard freeze in a lot of Ukraine is buying them some time. They'll get it if they're still in the field when the spring thaw fully hits. They'll get a second moment where off-road operations become hard. Summer is a great time for mobile operations in Ukraine, and you don't get more help until September, October, when you get the big fall rain before the winter freeze lets mobile operations. So I think that's what von Manstein would say if he was telling you about his experience in Ukraine from 41 to 44. But I don't know how to win a war these days.
Well, if they're in town getting heavy vehicles through that, I think it is delaying, but I don't think it's going to be. If Russia wants to keep pushing, it won't be consequential. They'll be able to work around it, and they could. I don't know about the 7 port. I don't know how that would play out for Russia. But excuse me, but I think it's. I don't think it's going to be determinative. I think it's helpful really right now for counterinsurgency to have vehicles stymied on roads and things. Wow, that's just a target-rich environment, and let's go after it, right? So that's I suppose that's what's happening. There's a lot of things probably happening we don't even know about, and they have the weapons to take care of that. Some weapons to take care of that. So that would be one for the Ukrainian military and the resistance.
I think something also is that we don't want to be too optimistic about logistical challenges that the Russians are facing right now. So it's been a week, right? And I think, if you look at even Iraq, right, the US intervening in Iraq, I don't think they had, overcome all logistical challenges within a week, right? And so I think we want to watch out against, being too optimistic. We see that like 40-mile Russian convoy being stuck and the tractor going to tank. That they're overcoming logistical challenges, but I don't think we want to get too optimistic.
Don't count on that. No, that's not going to. I don't.
They even won in Finland in the end in 39-40 when they had logistical challenges and incompetence, and they invaded Scandinavia in the dead of winter. They did it by throwing more manpower at Finland than they could muster, and they did it behind a carpet of artillery and bombing strikes against civilian targets. That's where we get Molotov cocktails from, by the way. The Finnish resistance. The Russians referred to carpet bombing cities as emergency food deliveries to starving workers. And so the Finns called them Molotov meals. And they repaid them with what they called Molotov cocktails. But Finland lost the winter war.
Let's pivot to a Zoom question.
All right, so I think it's something that's on a lot of folks' minds. Also, it's also on a lot of people's minds. Is so what circumstances would cause an escalation to the use of nuclear weapons by either the US or the Russians?
We were trying to be half full here.
If you
So-
affected me in the room, my concepts are never optimistic. I teach the world wars.
Okay, repeating the question, what circumstances would lead to an escalation and potentially the use of nuclear weapons?
Right.
I would-
Intentionally, I assume. I assume they mean intentional.
Well, it's both. I mean, I do think that is one thing that we're talking about. Once Russian nuclear weapons are put on alert, right, that increases the risk for accidental war. We know that if something is misperceived as an attack, right, if something is misperceived as moving into, for example, Poland or another one of the NATO allies, there is a possibility. Basically, it's brinkmanship, right? Like who gets to blink first, and so there is a risk. I mean, in a way, Putin, by putting himself in a position where there is an increased risk of an accidental use of nuclear weapons, right? He's signaling his resolve, his power, things like that. And so, yeah, accidental ones are ones to think about as well.
I think one of the biggest things about the use of tactical nuclear weapons is that Russia would have to break them out of their storage sites, and then they'd start to lose control of them. And if you recall back after 9/11, one of the biggest things we wrestled with was extremists getting a hold of some sort of fissile material, either a weapon or just the material itself, where they could do some kind of bomb that would obliterate large areas in terms of human habitation. So I really worry about that. That, you know, you could see a scheme where somebody might want to do that intentionally, you know, and I would just say that was our number one thing to worry about. And one of the reasons you worry about it is because the knowledge to use this stuff to build weapons is pretty readily available, it turns out, in today's world. And that's really scary. And if you don't think of violent extremists with no love for Russia, that's just the person or people they got the weapon from, it can be a very confusing world very quickly. And that is certainly a glass half full. That's a glass empty. But I just wanted to mention it because I think it's more than just a tactical use on the battlefield. If they have to break them out, take them out of where we've always presumed they're pretty well protected, then they run the risk they're going to fall in the wrong hands.
The quarter full is that it doesn't make a lot of sense for Putin to intentionally use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. He wants to conquer the place. And yeah, I mean, if you nuke Kiev, you're going to break the resistance in Kiev, but you've destroyed the thing you want to control. And he doesn't just want the land, he wants the people. He is trying to make Russia a global power. He needs land, resources, industry. He needs the Ukrainian people to add to Russian power. If you obliterate the cities, you've obliterated a large portion of the reason to do it. Now, he'll reduce them to a smoldering ruin with conventional weapons, because that's more or less how the Russian army has taken cities, is as far back as I've ever seen texts. But if he would decide to just nuke a Ukrainian city, it would be enormously counterproductive, at least for what he's doing. And the Ukrainian army it doesn't have formations big enough to be worth tac nuking if you're Russia. Having said that, they have a doctrine of de-escalation through escalation, where in theory, if they encounter direct combat with great powers, that they have this plan to nuke Western forces to force de-escalation. But the US had a lot of that doctrine in the 1950s too, and it's one thing to write it up when you're at the Training and Doctrine Command. It's another thing for a real life commander to say, I'm going to start shooting nuclear weapons right now because I think it'll de-escalate World War III, or at least I hope it's another thing for a commander to decide to do that.
So we could probably spend all day, but we're running out of time. So we'll have one more question.
Given the longer term, it's just surprising
pressure would be like for candidates running for 2024 and how Russian policy play an inevitable role, I think, in their agendas and how people decide to vote for.
Okay, so given the impact sanctions may have on the US domestic economy, how might that impact the 2024 presidential campaign? None of us are probably American politics experts, but we can.
I mean, I study American foreign policy, so I'll learn this often than together. So basically, what we're seeing right now is a rare moment of bipartisanship, right? Mostly, where both the Republicans and the Democrats are against Russia and are showing support for Ukraine. One of those few kind of politics such as the water's edge moment. But I think you're right in saying that the American public is very vulnerable to gas prices and thinking about these things. And so I think it's definitely something that is going to be used in the midterm election, certainly by the Republicans, right? Because it's Joe Biden who's putting the sanctions in place. And so it's definitely going to play a role. And so people, when they feel like their money isn't going as far, where they can't fill up their gas tanks, that is something that gets blamed on whoever is in power, which in this moment happens to be Joe Biden. And I'm sure it will be used politically against him, right? Not so much as in, oh, Ukraine is bad, but he made the wrong choice, right? Or, Putin invaded because Biden was weak, right? If it hadn't been him, it wouldn't have happened. I think there's definitely a way to politicize this within the US.
It's also interesting to think about the earlier part of the 2024 election, the Republican primary, because that's this can play out directly in the Republican primary, not just sanctions, larger policy. You have deep foreign policy divides within the Republican Party, and a Republican intellectual class which has been at war with itself since 2016. And this is already being used in that intellectual space as different factions fight it out. I mean, and if you want to see people who are really focused on this, look at Marco Rubio's Twitter feed. It's one of the best sources. I mean, actually, look at Marco Rubio's Twitter feed. It's one of the best sources of news for what's going on in Ukraine. And he clearly has people working intentionally to do this. This is political strategy at work. He ran last time. He wants to run again. He ran in 2016. He wants to run in 2014. This is a battle within the Republican Party between a more economically and politically nationalist factions and other factions that have some neoconservatism, have a lot of Reagan conservatism, those groups want to use Ukraine as a weapon, eventually against Biden, but against Donald Trump. For Trump's policies. Someone else who might be looking to do that is Mike Pompeo, who would like to run for president and was very anti-Russian as Secretary of State, who did a lot of things to get weapons into the hands of the Ukrainian army that President Trump wasn't so interested in. So this war is going to be fought in the Republican primary, where this will be a major issue in 2024. Who was weak? And assuming Ukraine falls, I pray it doesn't daily, but if it falls, who lost Ukraine? Remember that from the 1940s, who lost China? Part of the Republican Party will be attacking Trump as the man who lost Ukraine before they turn on Biden as the man who lost it.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I think we should thank our wonderful panelists. Have a good afternoon.
Everyone who joined us at home, thank you for logging in.
Yes.